And good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for CHRA's webinar, Does Your Retirement Plan Make a Social Impact with ESG Investing? My name is India Suter, and I'm the Director of Business Development at Asset Strategy Consultants, as well as a member of the Programming Committee for CHRA. Please be aware that all participant lines will be muted during the session to provide for the best sound quality. If you have any questions or any technical difficulties during the session, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom and something that will be monitored throughout. If you're still having difficulties, please email info@chra.com. If you cannot hear the audio through your computer speakers, you can call in using the call-in numbers and meeting IDs sent to you on your Zoom registration confirmation. Today's webinar will be recorded and be available for download on our website shortly. We will share details with the membership once it is available. Questions will be answered by the presenter at the end of the webinar or throughout if requested by the speaker. So I think what Keaton wants to do is go ahead and have you send in questions through the chat as you have them, and we'll take them as they come. And if you are SHRM or HRCI certified, this webinar is worth 1 hour of general HR credit for HRCA and 1 for CHRM towards your PDC recertification. And an email will come to you at the end today or tomorrow. For today's webinar, our speaker is Keaton Macut. In addition to being a great guy, Keaton is an advisor at Asset Strategies Harrisburg office, who advises plan sponsors and investment committees on defined contribution and defined benefit retirement plans. Keaton supports clients with investment advisory and retirement plan advice, from overseeing plan design and to advising individuals on private wealth management. Before settling into his current role, he started his career in the financial services industry at Federated and expanded his experience as VP at a national broker of clients and bringing on new business. Keaton earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Pittsburgh. In addition to being an investment, in addition to his investment advisor license, he is licensed in all lines insurance and has earned his accredited investment fiduciary member of the Retirement Advisors and Designers of America, and currently serves on a national 401k advisory committee that reviews sustainable investments in employer-sponsored retirement plans. With that, I'll turn it over to Keaton.
Hey, India, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organization CHRA for having me this morning. I know that with your population, you balance a lot of different hats in your roles, and I'd like to think of this webinar as a little bit more fun and educational, and maybe a little lighter than some of the webinars that your population will typically work through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here, and we are going to just jump right in. The whole purpose of this presentation is not to be an advocate, but to educate. So again, India, thank you. We're going to focus here on, does your retirement plan make a social impact with ESG investing? Again, I'm Keaton Macut with Asset Strategy Consultants. For over 30 years, Asset Strategy Consultants has operated giving institutional foundation and endowment investment advice, has operated as an outsourced investment office, and is also focused on private wealth. We're going to kind of switch gears and pivot to ESG investing today, and really there's going to be 3 topics. Essentially, we're going to talk about what, why, and how, right? So we're going to start with kind of what is ESG. We're going to define it. Secondly, we're going to go over why ESG is important. And tertiary, we're just going to better understand your retirement plan's social impact. I give this presentation a decent amount of time, and with frequency, I kind of understand most people are kind of looking at their phones during the first part when I go into the history of ESG. but really their ears start to perk up when we kind of reach the end of the conversation. And the reason why that is most, I would say most people, not just folks like you in the CHRA, most people don't really understand where their money is invested at the end of the day. And I think that's important, right? You work hard, your plan participants work hard. And, our job as either plan sponsors or investment committees or fiduciaries is to truly understand what makes up the retirement plan. So again, we're taking this from an educational point. I think that when the conversation opens at the end, most people are a little provoked in a good way to kind of ask stronger questions about where their retirement money is actually being spent. So what is ESG, right? Let's dive right in. We hear about it a lot. It seems to mean something different depending on who you talk to. To India's point a second ago, I sit on a national committee that studies corporate sustainability in retirement plans and what kind of large organizations are doing in the ESG space. And this is, and we'll talk about it in a second, it's not really a fad, but when we focus on ESG, it's really looking at non-financial issues that could have a financial implication for businesses, nonprofits, and other organizations. So basic definition here: E stands for environmental, S stands for social, and G stands for governance. Most people think of ESG just kind of along the lines of the environmental side, climate change, focusing on fossil fuels, chlorofluorocarbons, waste and pollution, deforestation. And that's fine, but that's really only 1/3 of the focus of the entire conversation, right? There's really been a good focus on the social, the S part of this, and this is really in regard to working conditions, including particularly in the international markets, slavery and child labor, indigenous communities and how businesses affect them, the health and welfare of employees and employee relations and diversity. And there's also been a big focus, I'd say, over the last few years on the governance side, and that's really how zeroing in how businesses are run when it comes to lobbying or tax strategy or executive pay relative to the average wage that a quote unquote rank and file or normal employee would pay. So there's kind of been this comprehensive overview in regard to what an ESG what ESG actually is. So again, non-financial issues that could have a financial implication for the business, right? And when you think about it in real terms, do you want your retirement plan to give money to organizations that are promoting slavery and child labor, that invest in businesses that are known for bribery and corruption, that aren't taking the conversation of climate change very seriously? Or do you want to pivot and actually understand, are there better options out there, right? That's all we're trying to do here. Something to think about is that ESG is not a fad. In fact, this is a hundreds of year old conversation, if you could believe that. It's a hot topic now, it seems, but it really does have a long history. When I started researching and really getting into the ESG work, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago. And the reason why asset strategy consultants got into the ESG focus originally is because we had a large plan sponsor ask us about exposure to fossil fuels. And at the time, there wasn't a good report or metric or way to study what the exposure was. So essentially what we had to do is get really sharp on this topic really quick. So I became a sponge and started absorbing all of the information that I could. So when I started doing this, it wasn't necessarily a hot topic. I'd probably 1 in 20, maybe 1 in 30 plan sponsors would ask a question about impact investing or ESG investing or green investing. Now it's probably 1 in 4 plan sponsors or investment committees are bringing up these topics. So I won't spend too much time here going through the slides, but it's really, it really started out in the 1800s, right? As more of a socially responsible investing strategy that really started with the Quakers and the Methodists, really investing in line with their religious teachings. And if you kind of look in the middle of the slide here, in the early 2000s, the ESG investing really began to get some mainstream traction. You might remember a gentleman by the name of Kofi Annan, who was Secretary of the United Nations, and really put in some, they call it the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, really took a global initiative to employ like an ESG factor analysis for global investments. And admittedly, the United States was a little slow on the uptake and the focus. It really started probably in the Nordic countries. If we talk about the recent ESG focus, it started in the Nordic countries. It kind of got traction in the Australia area after that, moved up to Canada, and then finally the US, I would say, became a little bit more serious about that. What I kind of find interesting is if you look at the 2020 number, 1 in every $3 invested goes into ESG strategies. So that kind of aligns with what the plan sponsors, if I take a look at the beginning of this conversation, when I started talking about 1 in every 20 or 1 in every 30 investment committees, plan sponsors wanted to talk about ESG. Now we're seeing essentially a third of investments going into an impact investment strategy. So there's definitely a focus of it not being a fad in today's world. So why is ESG important to discuss, right? So ESG is a fad. You probably hear this a lot. ESG is for tree huggers. It's nice, but we're really focused on returns. So why is this important, right? Why am I taking some time to talk to you today? So it's not a trend, right? It kind of has a long history. It's become very popular. Not only in my conversations, but if you take the time to talk to your plan participants, and I'll talk about some specifics here in a few minutes, most plan participants, in fact, most people in general, have a philosophy, or they have an idea about how they feel about weapons of war, about climate change, about gender equality in the workplace. People want it, right? They want to have a conversation about it. This is how the world's kind of developing, right? It's not really a trend. Companies have really been adapting to consumer demands to be a little bit more cognizant of these ESG focal points, and governments are applying pressure to businesses to try to conform kind of in this ESG rectangle, right? So people want it, companies want it, governments are working towards it. If we continue about why this is important, most financial advisors and consultants, they look at kind of the buzzwords: risk-adjusted return, dividends, quality of investments, earnings per share, who the manager is, expense ratios. And I'm a fiduciary. You should continue to look at that, right? What we're talking about today is a little outside of this. These are all very important, but again, this is on the education side of how investments are actually looked at and where the money's going. So kind of the interesting thing in our world is that there's new pending DOL guidance that will more than likely change the landscape with this administration. But there certainly is an appetite to ask more long-term questions based on non-financial factors. Some of the interesting things that plan sponsors, these are real, by the way, that plan sponsors have talked to me about, kind of before the ESG conversation, it was, hey, how's our retirement plan performing? How are plan participants liking the plan? Should we update our match? And now I'm getting real questions like, talk to me about scope emissions, right? That completely blindsided me. Luckily, I know what 1, 2, and 3 scope emissions are. But that's not something I was expecting from a plan sponsor. But talk to me about scope emissions. Have there been allegations of fraud and corruption in the companies that we're investing in our retirement plan? Tell me what the board structure looks like. Is there a focus on gender equality, or is it a very rigid governance board? And the other one that really caught me off guard is, tell me about their supply chain ethics. How are they manufacturing? What does their supply chain look like? What is the industrial side of the business work? So I bring this up as a why is this important slide? It's because the conversation's really changing, right? Also, why talk about ESG? Participants are demanding it, right? This is a study from MFS in 2020, but the data suggests the plurality of participants are interested in ESG investments. I just put an arrow to the square on the right-hand side. You can see that the younger the generation, the more important ESG topics are to that generation, right? I thought these pie charts were a little interesting here at the bottom. When you kind of take a look at the interest in ESG investments, 70% are either interested or somewhat interested in ESG investments, compared to 3/10, which are not so interested. And if you think about kind of the basic idea of why do you sponsor a retirement plan, right? It's to help your participants retire on time with dignity, to create a natural succession in the workplace, to help with mental health when it comes to financial wellness. So there's definitely some interest on the plan participant side, and that really translates into a likelihood to contribute more. If you look at that 65% between extremely likely and somewhat likely to contribute more based off of the investment options inside the plan, people like to support, with their dollars, what they believe in, right? So when you think about sponsoring a plan, a retirement plan, does your plan actually reflect what your plan participants are excited about? I won't spend too much time here on the multi-decade saga of the evolution of DOL ESG guidance. A good way to think about this is that it's like a seesaw, right? Depending on the administration in power, there's either a kind of favor towards ESG investments in retirement plans, or there's kind of I'd say an anti-ESG sentiment in retirement plans. The previous administration under Donald Trump, they didn't necessarily love the idea of ESG investments inside of a plan. There's kind of this famous rule back at the end of his presidency before the transition, that we call it the pecuniary rule, but essentially it said fiduciaries must solely base investment decisions on pecuniary factors. And what the Biden administration is doing is they're looking to essentially not enforce that ESG rule, right? But they're also looking to put into law through the DOL implementation of adding some ESG language to make it possibly mandatory to have an ESG option in the retirement plan. So there's a lot of change that happens depending on who's in power. But with the way the winds are blowing right now, I'd be pretty interested to see either this year in 2022 or 2023 the favorability of ESG investments in retirement plans to the Biden administration. So there's definitely a push on the governmental side as well, right? So just to kind of recap that, we understood what ESG investments are. We understand now that there's a push not only from the plan participant side, there's a focus coming from plan sponsors asking these good questions, and there's also a focus with the current administration trying to be a little bit more open to impact investing in ESG in qualified and non-qualified retirement plans. So this is the interesting part, I promise you. If your eyes are glazed over, you will like this part, I promise you. But really, the kind of the last part of this, and I'll try to spend the most time here, is how can you better understand your retirement plan's social impact? So if at some point in this conversation, hey, this sounds good, but what are you actually talking about, Keaton? There's kind of a challenge of addressing diverse participant populations. So ESG has gotten very popular to talk about, and I typically err on the side of kind of the simpler, the more simple, the better. And there's a lot of approaches when it comes to incorporating ESG investing in defined contribution plans. Depending on what the plan sponsor and the mission of the organization and the investment policy statement states and what the plan participants want, there could be a ton of different ESG factors to consider, right? Bribery and corruption, clean drinking water, focus on fossil fuels, pay gaps, gender equality, climate change, right? There's a lot of things to focus on. Statistically, if you look at kind of where the key focus is, most people think that environmental, social, and governance are equally important. If you have to break it down by section, most people care about the environment in this study that we're looking at, and followed closely by governance and social. So so ESG are equally important. That's a kind of a big focus here. Moving right along, if you are a plan sponsor or are on the investment committee or part of the C-suite or have a say in regard to where where plan participants could put their money in a retirement plan. As a fiduciary, it's your obligation to be educated and understand your social impact, right? You need to understand there's a duty, right? You need to understand where the money's actually going. So at Asset Strategy Consultants, again, we try to be proactive and forward thinking about helping plan sponsors better not only understand their investments, but have better conversations with their plan participants. So again, our job is to help educate. And what we've done is we've built out a really nice analysis for the folks that we work with and review investment menus to screen for ESG values and defined contribution plans. What we do is we have a really, I'd say, sophisticated scoring system, simple but sophisticated scoring system. And we've done a good job of then kind of reviewing how retirement plans function. There are everyone seems to have a rating system to focus on ESG nowadays. Here are a few examples. But the reason why we included this, we think this is important, is if you look at the metrics being used, this is the far right column, by the way, there are a ton of metrics, and there's no really uniformity across the measures. The top three, I would say, really are Sustainalytics, MSCI, and Bloomberg. But if you look at the metrics on, I'll just use MSCI as an example, there are a ton of metrics that you could look at, and plan sponsors, whenever we run off these reports and you start looking at hundreds of metrics, typically get bogged down in the details. And what we've done at Asset Strategy Consultants is we've put a simple conversation to work, right? So instead of looking at the 3 pillars with the 10 themes and the 37 sector-based key issues, and again, it's over 1,000 data points that the MSCI ESG research is doing, what we've done is we've kind of cleaned up the conversation based off of the dialogue that we're having with plan sponsors and investment committees. So what I decided to do today for this presentation is provide some real examples of conversations that we've had with plan sponsors. And here are 3 questions, and here's kind of our process, right? It's pretty, you can replicate our process. I would say the reason why we specialize in this space is that it takes a lot of people hours to create the report and actually do the deep dive. But at any rate, here are 3 questions. We'll address them, and I'll kind of go through our process. And if this maybe turns a light switch on in your head and say, hey, maybe I care about this, maybe we should get together, I think it's a wise idea, because again, it's your job to be educated, right? So 3 questions I'm going to address today in the conversation are, hey, we're concerned about fossil fuels in the future of our planet. Completely relevant point to make, and it seems to be a very major talking point in the ESG space. A question we got are we invested in weapons of war? And I'll talk about this second. And in this specific example, weapons of war meaning bombs, not necessarily weapons of war meaning assault style handguns, just to clarify. And then lastly, I got a question. We want to understand our exposure when it comes to the prison industrial complex, which that really blindsided me. So we had to do some decent research on that. But at any rate, I'll talk about the first one in regard to fossil fuels. So again, that question's up at the top. We're concerned about fossil fuels and the future of our planet, right? So what we do is we will take an investment menu, typically composed of mutual funds. And what we will do is we will look at that investment menu that a plan sponsor provides to us, and we will make a determination of if those funds are actually invested in the fossil fuel industry. So for this specific example, we look at 16 different industries. This is not only mining and drilling, but this is also pipeline operators, storage, transport. And again, this is an advocacy conversation. This is an education conversation. So what I did for the purpose of this presentation is I just used a passive index fund like the S&P 500 index fund, as opposed to using some real examples that we've done in the past. I'll just use the index fund as an example. But most plans have kind of a passive index fund that will mirror the S&P 500. Again, our goal is to help plan sponsors better understand their exposure. You'll see that on the next few slides. I just want to hit that point home. Our job is to help educate. So relevant questions you want to ask about your investment lineup, if the plan sponsor and the plan participants in the investment policy statement care, hey, are there oil and gas companies that you're invested in with your retirement plan options? Hey, are there utility companies that use fossil fuels to generate energy? These are very relevant questions. And we did a study for a plan out in California, large retirement plan, and they were amazed. Now, again, I'm using the S&P 500 as an example here. They were amazed at the 9 funds that they owned that were invested in the fossil fuel industry. They are huge advocates of kind of the anti-fossil fuel. So anyway, when we sat down and kind of reviewed our notes and the analysis, they were blown away because they just never looked at this. So at any rate, I use the example of a widely used S&P 500 index fund, which has roughly $32.86 billion of fossil fuel investments in the fund. It has roughly 51 fossil fuel stocks and is roughly 9% of all the assets in the fund. By the way, this is we actually did this for another organization outside of the one in California. This one is in the Northeast, and it was a commercial painter. This organization, I'm sure most of you know what a B Corp is. They take their B Corp rating very seriously. I've actually sat in on a few of their meetings and did a similar fossil fuel study for them. And they were really surprised that no one's ever brought this to their attention. So it actually became the retirement plan dialogue based off of the report we provided them, kind of worked its way into the B Corp conversation that they do. So pretty interesting. If you're interested in understanding exposure and being educated on kind of the fossil fuel investments in your plan, well, I think this is a nice kind of place to start, right? Second topic, are we invested in weapons of war? Again, I'll say most plans have a passive index fund that'll mirror the S&P 500. Our goal is to help plan sponsors, right? I can't stress that enough. Better understand their exposure and the plan participant exposure. So questions that we have around the weapons of war is our retirement plan contributing to armed conflicts across the world? I think that's a pretty relevant conversation to have. And then, does our retirement plan support nuclear weapons? So what we've done is we've built out a report at Asset Strategy Consultants to address these key questions, right? So we look at kind of 3 main areas, right? We look at, if plan sponsors are interested in this, we look at nuclear weapons, we look at cluster munitions, and then we also look at kind of the big military contractors. If you're a plan sponsor and you care about this, you want to know, hey, are we invested in weapons of war? Just using kind of the widely used S&P 500 index fund as an example. Now, we would do this for all funds, but it has $9.86 billion of military weapon investments in the fund, 17 weapons of war stocks, and roughly 2.5% of the assets in the fund. So again, we did this for a nonprofit. Let's see, I guess this was in the Baltimore area. It, as you might imagine, there was kind of a let's call it an anti-war sentiment to the nonprofit. And again, when we sat down and did the analysis and actually looked at the plan and where their retirement dollars were going, it was kind of an interesting conversation to see where the money was actually being, funneled to in the retirement plan. So weapons of war, by the way, we look at roughly 8 different, we call them negative screens, 8 different screens. We also do one for guns and gun manufacturers. That's an education report. We've done both, we've done all 8, right, for organizations, but most people have an opinion on guns one way or another, assault style weapons one way or another. And again, people just want to know about their investment dollars for their plan that they're sponsoring, right? Lastly, this is kind of the one that blindsided me, but we essentially had to build a report out in understanding exposure when it comes to prison industrial complex, right? Most plans have a passive index fund that'll mirror the S&P 500. We're using this as an example again. Our goal is to help plan sponsors better understand their exposure. And this one was really interesting. This was for a nonprofit. They do a lot of lobbying work in regard to prison reform. And one of the things they're looking to reform all across the country is what they call mandatory minimum sentencing. So it's a little bit of the opinion the punishment should fit the crime. There shouldn't be a mandatory punishment based off of a specific crime. There's a little bit of nuances is the argument they make, but at any rate, you would imagine that a group like this is not necessarily in favor of the prison for profit systems. So the questions we had are, hey, is our retirement plan invested in the prison for profit systems? And the other interesting part of this is, hey, do we have investments in detention facilities, specifically referencing detention facilities on the U.S. and Mexico border, right? Hey, is our retirement money going to these areas that we're not necessarily enamored with? And our job is to educate and help people understand. So, well, in the S&P 500 index fund, there's roughly $87 billion in the prison industrial complex investments, 36 prison and detention stocks, and it comprised of roughly 24% of all the assets in the fund, right? So not only the facilities and the owners, but who's providing food, who's providing software, who's providing surveillance material, who's doing the cloud computing. When you start thinking about where your retirement dollars are actually going, and your organization cares something about fossil fuel exposure, prison industrial complex, weapons of war, gender equality in the workplace, deforestation, there starts to be some pretty robust conversations in regard to what type of report and conversation we can have with investment committees to help them better understand where their money's going. So with that, in respect to your time, I just want to say before the Q&A, again, this is not an advocacy conversation, but our goal at Asset Strategy Consultants is to help our plan sponsors just better understand their exposure in these industries if they want to understand it better. And what we've done is kind of a service model, is just help plan sponsors review these categories that they care about and help them if they're interested, kind of pivot away from their current plan design is a good way to look at that. And most plan sponsors, in our experience, when we talk to new plan sponsors, they haven't updated their plan design, their investments, their overall strategy since before COVID. And how has the world changed in the past 2 years? Almost entirely, right? So when you're reviewing your plan design, your summary plan description, your investment policy statement, if you care about ESG investments in your retirement plan, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm obviously very passionate about helping plan sponsors better understand their exposure. India and I or someone on our team are more than happy to come out and meet with you to help you better, A, understand the conversation, or B, and maybe more importantly, have a conversation with your plan participants to kind of understand what their wants and needs are when it comes to ESG investments. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. India, is there a Q&A session? Are we getting any questions, or everyone's completely fulfilled with the ESG the ESG conversation?
So I have a comment and a question that might spur some things. A lot of you may have already thought about ESG, investigated ESG or SRI, socially responsible investing. And a lot of this you might find is because your participants, your actual employees, are asking you these questions because it becomes important to them. And now with hiring and keeping employees, it's becoming an even bigger deal. These younger people are coming in and they might be asking these types of questions, and certainly you want to be equipped to answer them. So that's my comment. And my question is, Keaton, if I was a plan sponsor and I was interested in evaluating my plan doc and design and maybe having some discussions about ESG, where do I start? What do I do first?
I would say where you want to start is you want to understand what you're passionate about, right? If we're happy to do the work, but if it doesn't align with what the organization values are, or what the investment committee's values are, you just got to understand what you want, right? You got to know what you want, and then we can help you. I would say more directly, if you're a plan sponsor or in a leadership position, reach out to India or myself. Again, we are more than happy to just come on site or set up a Zoom call or a telephone call with your leadership team, just to help understand kind of where you're at and where you want to be. I think the slide that I provided on the metrics is very important, because you start having a conversation, you start looking at 1,000 different points of data. Those conversations, in my experience, have gone sideways pretty quickly, which is why we've really done a good job on the analysis. So I would say understand what you want, and then either reach out to India or myself and schedule a call or set up a meeting. We're happy to do this for the CHRA, by the way. We absolutely budget some time out and then just have a dialogue. And India, you make a really good comment, though, in regard to the hiring side. Who's having trouble right now hiring people? We certainly are, right? So any incentive, particularly just statistically on the younger millennials and Generation Z, having a focus, if you're passionate about ESG, having a focus on that and kind of aligning with those values of the younger generations, I think it's a difference maker. I think it's a differentiator. People like to work for organizations that share their views and their visions, as opposed to just thinking of it as a day job, or hey, I got to go to work. If there is a vision or a mission that aligns with your employees, you all know better than I do. Those employees are going to stay with you. It's going to be great for retention. It's going to be really good for hiring. And frankly, you're just being proactive, right? You have a duty as a fiduciary to understand your plan, but as an employer, you want to retain and recruit the best of the best and people that share the mission and vision. So I thought it was a really good comment, India.
So one more thing I'm seeing is people asking about the risk and return and the actual value of the investment versus, it being an ESG or SRI investment. And what do you have to say about that?
That's a really strong question. If you had another 45 minutes, I'm happy to talk about that. We look at this a lot, and depending on, you have to, again, I had the slide where risk-adjusted return absolutely matters, manager strategy absolutely matters, drawdown and investment expense, all these kind of normal financial metrics matter. When it comes to performance, there is a lot of indication that if a manager has an ESG focus, there's some really strong managers that outperform kind of the non-ESG option. And we have a lot of data on that we can review. Kind of an interesting thing, and this is not an investment recommendation or advice, but one of the interesting things that's kind of come out of this, I'll give you an example. There is a manager out in California that has created an S&P 500 index without any of the fossil fuel exposure. So I think it's roughly, 447 stocks, and it's actually outperforming the S&P, which is a little interesting. Now, granted, that was just created, and there's a little bit of a kind of a short-term window. So I'll be kind of interested to see what it'll do in the long term. But for the managers that do have a long-term track history, 3, 5, 10-year return, I have some really, really strong data that will show outperformance relative to the index and the benchmark, the category benchmark for those investments. So most people think, hey, I'm going to sacrifice a little bit of returns to do good. And that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, so that definitely dispels the way it may have used to have been before, in the maybe 5 years ago. But ESG has really taken a turn and become more popular and just given better overall results.
Without question, you can absolutely tell there is a big initiative to outperform on the ESG side. All the major firms, Fidelity and Vanguard and BlackRock and T. Rowe, they all have an ESG team, and they want to outperform, right? They want to be the best in the space. And I would argue that they're a little bit more focused, right? They want to beat the non-ESG option, right? So there's a really nice incentive for them to outperform. And it's depending on where you go, right? You got to study it. You want the outperformance, and ESG, there are some really good ESG managers that'll do the outperformance relative to the category in the index.
Well, great. I don't see any other questions. So thank you, Keaton, for a great presentation and a very informative webinar. We ask that today's attendees take a minute or two to fill out our post-webinar survey that will be sent out with a copy of the recording. And we definitely appreciate your input on this. We'll be sending the recording of today's webinar to those who attended this session, as well as an email with the recertification IDs. This concludes today's presentation. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, Implementing a High Performance Culture, being held on September 8th.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again, guys.